Welcome to Story Reading. In this channel, I focus two functions of English, story and conversation. However, this video I gonna make up about English story. Let's start it. After 20 years. 20 years can change a man. The time was nearly 10 o'clock at night, and the streets had forced most people to stay indoors. The police officer on the beat moved slowly up the avenue. The guardian of the peace tried doors as he went and looked in store windows along the way. Most of the places in the vicinity were closed. Now and then you might see lights in a luncheonette that stayed open all night, but the majority of the doors belonged to businesses that had been shut for hours. In the middle of a certain block, the officer suddenly slowed his walk. In the dark doorway of a hardware store, a man stood, with an unlighted cigar in his mouth. As the police officer walked up to him, the man spoke up quickly. "It's all right, officer," the man said reassuringly. "I'm just waiting for a friend. It's an appointment that we made 20 years ago." The officer looked surprised and stared at the man. "I guess it sounds a little funny to you, doesn't it?" said the man. "Well, I can explain it. 20 years ago, there used to be a restaurant where this store is now." "Yes," said the officer. "That was Joe Brady's restaurant. It was here until 5 years ago. It was torn down then." The man in the doorway struck a match and lit a cigar. The officer saw that the man had a pale, square face with keen eyes. There was a little scar near the man's right eyebrow. The man was wearing a scarf whose ends were held together by a shiny gold pin. In the center of the pin was a large, sparkling diamond. The man said, "Exactly 20 years ago tonight I ate dinner with Jimmy Wells at Joe Brady's restaurant here. Jimmy was my best friend and the greatest pal in the world. He and I were born in New York and grew up together. We were as close as two brothers." The man in the doorway paused for a moment as he thought about his friend. Then he continued, "I was 18 and Jimmy was 20. The next morning I was going to leave for the West to make my fortune. But you couldn't have dragged Jimmy out of New York. He thought it was the best place on earth. Well, we agreed that night that we would meet here again exactly 20 years from that date and time, no matter how our lives had changed or how far we had to travel. We figured that in 20 years each of us would have his destiny worked out, whatever it might be." "That sounds pretty interesting to me," said the officer. "But 20 years is a long time to wait before getting together. Have you heard from your friend? Contact with?" "Well, yes, for a while we corresponded. But after a year or two we stopped writing and didn't keep in touch with each other. You see, the West is a pretty big place, and I kept moving around all the time. But I know that Jimmy will meet me here if he's alive. He was always the truest, most reliable guy in the world. He'll never forget. I came 1,000 miles to stand in this doorway tonight, and it will be worth it if my old friend shows up." The man pulled out a handsome gold watch. The officer saw that the hands of the watch were made of small diamonds. "It's 3 minutes before 10, the man in the doorway announced. It was exactly 10 o'clock when we left the restaurant 20 years ago. You did pretty well out west, didn't you?" asked the officer. Oh, yes, I certainly did. I hope Jimmy has done half as well. He was never as bold as me, though. I've had to compete with some of the smartest guys around. But I took some chances, made a lot of money, and can go out on top. You have to be pretty sharp to do well in New York, but out west I learned how to be as sharp as a razor. The police officer took a step or two. Well, he said, I'll be going now. I hope that your friend shows up. Are you going to leave if he doesn't get here on time? No, not at all, the other man said. I'll wait at least another half an hour. If Jimmy is alive on Earth, he'll be here by then. Good night, officer. Good night, sir, said the officer, and he moved on, trying doors as he went. There was now a light, cold drizzle falling, and the wind was beginning to blow harder. The few people in the street hurried silently and dismally along, their coat collars pulled up, their hands in their pockets. And in the doorway of the hardware store stood the man who had come 1,000 miles to keep an appointment he had made 20 years ago. He smoked a cigar and he waited. He waited about 20 minutes. Then a tall man in a long overcoat, with the collar turned up to his ears, hurried across from the opposite side of the street. The tall man went straight to the man who was waiting in the doorway. The tall man paused and then asked, "Is that you, Bob?" "Jimmy Wells." "Is that you?" exclaimed the man in the doorway. "One was sure you would come." The man who had just arrived threw his arms around the other man and shook his hand. "Bob," he said, "I was certain I would find you here if you were still alive." Well, 20 years is a long time. The old restaurant is gone, Bob. I wish it were still here, so we could enjoy another dinner there now. The tall man stepped back and asked, "How has the West treated you, old pal?" "Great. It has given me everything I wanted. You've changed quite a bit, Jimmy. You look 2 or 3 inches taller than I remembered." "Oh, I grew a few inches after I was 20. Are you doing well in New York, Jimmy?" "Fairly well," said the tall man. "I have a job in one of the city's departments. Come on, Bob. We'll go to a place I know and have a good long talk about old times." The two men walked up the street, arm in arm. The man from the West, extremely pleased with his success, was talking about himself in a rather conceited way. The other man, submerged in his overcoat, listened with interest. To be under, at the corner stood a drugstore that was bright with lights. When they came into this glare, each man turned simultaneously to look at the man from the West, stopped suddenly and released the other man's arm. "You're not Jimmy Wells," he exclaimed in distress. 20 years is a long time, but it's not long enough to change the shape of a man's nose. "It sometimes changes a good man into a bad one," said the tall man. The tall man put his arm on the other man's shoulder and said, "You've been under arrest for 10 minutes, Silky Bob. We heard from the Chicago police that you were heading our way, and they want to have a little talk with you there." "Going quietly, are you? That's sensible. Now, before we go to the station, here's a note I was asked to give to you. It's from Officer Wells." The man from the West looked at the piece of paper the tall man gave him. His hand was steady when he began to read, but it trembled a little by the time he had finished. The note was very short. Bob, I was at the meeting place on time. When you struck the match to light your cigar, I saw that you were the man wanted for robbery in Chicago. Somehow, I couldn't arrest you myself, so I went and got a detective to do the job. The note from Well. Bob, I was at the meeting place on time. When you struck the match to light your cigar, I saw that you were the man wanted for robbery in Chicago. Somehow, I couldn't arrest you myself, so I went and got a detective to do the job.